Hello. So today I'd like to talk about a topic that recently came up in the SAFE class that I help facilitate online. And it's also something that I've been thinking about for quite a while. And that's the topic of addiction and how overcoming an addiction is similar in many ways to trying to break free of cyclic existence by practicing the Dharma. So a number of people in the SAFE class have attended Alcoholics Anonymous. And some of them said that trying to overcome their addiction is actually what brought them to the spiritual path. So I myself spent a good part of my late teens and early 20s addicted to cigarettes and other kinds of substances. And at the time, they seemed like a really good escape from the anxiety and insecurity I was feeling. Quickly, it became a daily activity, and I created a lot of negative karma in the process, including lying, stealing, and harming my body and others' bodies. So it took many attempts, but eventually I was able to quit all drugs by my mid-20s. And I, of course, regret taking this detour, but I feel that this experience helped me to develop some inner strength that I feel has been useful for Dharma practice. I think one of the most sobering things to think about is that we're actually addicted to the sources of our suffering. And this means that we are constantly turning for relief and pleasure to things that only bring disappointment and more craving. And this is because all of the objects that we experience on a daily basis are impermanent and unable to bring any lasting happiness. So in fact, relying on these external sources of pleasure increases our dissatisfaction. And we get into the habit of feeding our craving rather than challenging or transforming it by working with our minds. So the Buddha compared this destructive habit of relying on sense gratification to drinking salt water. The more we consume, the more our thirst increases. And in everyday life, when we talk about addictions, most people think about alcohol, drugs, maybe gambling, shopping, but there's actually many kinds of addictions out there. There's also food, exercise, video games, sex, hoarding, and the list goes on and on. And this is because our minds can exaggerate any object and its desirability when it views it through the lens of attachment, which really exaggerates the good qualities of the object or can even project good qualities that aren't there. So when we practice the Dharma, we're trying to overcome our addictions to the 8 worldly concerns. And these are usually spoken about in pairs. So the first pair is attachment to gain and aversion to loss. Then attachment to praise, aversion to blame. Attachment to having a good reputation and aversion to having a bad reputation. And then attachment to pleasure and aversion to pain. If we look closely, we'll see that these worldly concerns drive almost all of our behavior all day long. And they seem to be pretty normal concerns to have as human beings. But the problem is that we can't ever control the external environment. And so we inevitably meet with loss, with blame, with slander, and pain. And all of our wealth, praise, reputation, and pleasure inevitably elude us. And we suffer so much as a result of our involvement with these 8 worldly concerns, and we end up harming others in the process of trying to get these or trying to avoid them. So by practicing the Dharma, we're starting to turn away from the 8 worldly concerns and starting to look within our own minds for the causes of happiness. And luckily, I was able to quit my addictions without going to a rehab clinic. So I did some research online to find out what are some of the steps involved in officially overcoming addictions. And a few websites that I found described a 6-step process, although most people are probably familiar with the 12-step process that is talked about in Alcoholics Anonymous. But this process doesn't have any references to God. So I just want to quote one website. It said that overcoming an addiction is never an easy or straightforward process. It requires conscious work, effort, and time. And I would say this also applies to overcoming our addictions to our worldly pleasures and also to the sense of an inherently existent self. So the first step in overcoming an addiction is acknowledging that you have one. And when we start down the Buddhist path, we have to admit that we are under the control of the afflictions of greed, hatred, and delusion, as well as the negative karma that we've created in the past. I think we all like to think that we're sane, decent people, but if we look closely, we'll soon discover many thoughts and behaviors that we would do away with immediately if we could. And this first step may sound simple, but it's by no means easy because it requires us to admit that we're not in control of our lives and are a danger to ourselves and others. And this is probably why many addicts linger in denial. The thought of admitting their powerlessness can be quite terrifying. But without acknowledging this truth, there's simply no hope for recovery. Coming to the conclusion that we're unable to manage our minds leads us to search for a reliable guide to help us out of our situation. And for Buddhists, this means turning to the Buddha, his teachings, and his spiritual community as a source of support. So then the second step in overcoming an addiction is to take responsibility for our emotions and our behavior. And usually we want to blame the outside world for our hatred, our fear, our lust, and the actions that these afflictions provoke. But the root causes of these afflictions is within our minds. So as Dharma practitioners, we stop blaming everybody else for our unhappiness and commit ourselves to undertaking a training and discipline in order to transform our minds. And this is something that we can only do for ourselves. Not even the Buddha can help us get free of samsara if we're not willing to put forth the effort. So then the third step of overcoming an addiction is to undertake a self-evaluation. And this involves looking closely at our behaviors and our beliefs to see how they're contributing to our suffering and to identify the motivations behind our actions. And what I found is that this process is not always pleasant and can be downright shocking and horrifying. So the process of observing our minds requires a lot of fortitude and self-compassion, because so nakedly seeing our afflictions and self-centeredness challenges this idea we have of ourselves as a nice person, basically. And also the self-centered mind doesn't like being exposed, and it throws up all kinds of rationales to get us to keep acting the same way that we've always done. So developing compassion and loving kindness towards ourselves is what will allow us to go deeply into our minds, to discover the roots of these destructive behaviors, and to heal whatever misunderstandings led to them in the first place. Then the fourth step of overcoming addiction is generating a new behavior. And for addicts, this, of course, involves putting down the substance, staying away from it, and developing new habits that meet the underlying needs that the addiction was somewhat meeting. So when we decide to set down an addiction or to forego one of the worldly pleasures, it might feel like we're depriving ourselves of happiness and relief, but actually, practicing the Dharma doesn't mean that we stop pursuing joy, happiness, and connection. We just learn to cultivate it in different ways. So instead of expecting all of our love to come from our family and our friends, we do meditation on loving kindness so that we generate this mental state within ourselves, and then we're able to experience it regardless of whatever situation that we're in. We don't stop having relationships with others, but we become less picky and we take more pleasure in giving rather than getting. And instead of pursuing temporary gratification through the sense pleasures, we decide to discipline and tame our minds so that confidence, peace, and harmony naturally arise. Then the fifth step of overcoming an addiction is to consider the consequences of not changing our behavior. And this is probably all familiar to you as part of the techniques in the Lambrim, where in order to stop doing an unskillful behavior, we consider the disadvantages to continuing to do that. And then the last step in overcoming addiction is to take gradual steps to change our behavior. And this is where we have to put forth a lot of effort and patience to actualize our wish to change. And this is by no means easy. If we've ever tried to break a habit, I think we all know it takes quite a few times in order to be successful. And in the process, we're highly vulnerable to discouragement or thoughts of just giving up. And what I found most important in these times is just to hold on to the intention to change. Even if I can't do it right now, I still want to do it one day. And then make an effort in that direction, no matter how small. And then these websites also pointed out that healthy eating, sleeping, exercising, and having meaningful hobbies and activities leads to an underlying sense of well-being that can contribute to our recovery. So the articles noticed that, one of the articles noted that by overcoming our addiction, we will be free to be the person that we've always wanted to be. And I think the goal of Dharma practice is much the same. Because when we practice the Dharma, we're trying to become Buddhas, which are people who have boundless love, compassion, wisdom, and the skillful means to be able to help all others. So whether we've had addictions or not, formally, may we continue to let go of those things that cause us suffering and to let go of these false refuges that seem to bring happiness, but in the end always let us down. And may we continue to help others to do that process as well.